Hello and welcome back. My name is Tyler King. Thanks for hanging out on my channel. Today I am doing part 2 of my Dragon Age portrait. Special shout out to Bloodrit, who donated her beautiful face to let me use her as a reference for this Dragon Age Morrigan portrait. Let's just get started, shall we? So you may have just been coming here from part 1, where I sort of laid down the basic idea of what I was doing with this portrait, as well as doing most of the details and rendering on the face. In this part, I will be focusing primarily on the hands, and by primarily I mean almost entirely on the hands. It wasn't until I really started getting into rendering and processing how I wanted to do the hands that I realized that I really messed up the light source here. As I did in the first part, so as I start working and painting and sort of fleshing out the details of what I want to do with this hand, I do use the lasso tool and the transform tool to manipulate and make things a little bit more realistic as far as size. As I said in the first video, it might be easier to start off with a sketch that you've already really liked and you felt that the proportions to the character are correct, but I find it personally more fun to just paint as I go and figure out sizes and shape as I go, just constantly looking at the reference and going from there. So similar to how I did the face in part 1, what I'm doing is taking the regular sort of flesh tone colors that I've chosen for this painting to basically mark where the indents and the details and the wrinkles of the fingers are gonna go, because later on I'm going to be taking that green color from the amulet and washing over it with an airbrush just to basically show that the light source is so close to the hand that the hand is basically going to be completely green. It wasn't until a bit later on that I realized that the light isn't actually shining underneath the hand, it's shining on top of it, so all that place that I just laid a bunch of highlight is actually going to be shadow later, but we'll get to that. So now you can see that I'm slowly adding that green on top, and I think the reason that I didn't just jump straight into the green was because I'm working a lot with transparency. I actually really like to draw sort of like the regular colors and then use a transparent brush on top, which I think is more of a cheating thing than what I should actually be doing. But it does create a really nice effect, and it helps preserve the colors of the skin that I had already laid down, and it makes it just look a little bit more whole. So now I've really decided to take that bright highlight and just slap it on everywhere it goes. Now this is the part where I realize that the underneath the palm is actually filled with shadow. So you'll notice that the shadow close to the green light is actually in and of itself a dark green color, whereas the shadow in the rest of the portrait is more of a purpley color. Now the reason for this is because it is reflecting the green light that the shadow itself is also green. But as you get further and further away from the amulet as a light source, the shadows revert back to that dark purple color in the rest of the portrait. So a lot of my rendering style has to do with how I work with layers. So I've talked a bit before about how I have two brushes that are exactly the same, except one has an acrylic brush texture and one is just a soft round brush. So what I tend to do is work on an empty layer, and then when I'm sort of satisfied with what I've drawn, I will actually drop what I've drawn onto the base layer and continue working like that. And the reason I do this is because I like to work with blendable brushes, but sometimes if you just keep adding more color to something and keep blending, you're gonna lose some of the strength of that color. So depending on my needs, I will either work on the original layer, which has all the colors smooshed together, or I'll work on an empty layer on top of it and then just kind of work my way through that. And really that's the only technique that there is to it for me. I don't often mess with layer modes. At most what I'll do is a luminosity layer mode, where if I have something that's a really bright highlight, I will draw it on an empty layer with the luminosity mode, drop it down on the layer below that, and then kind of blend from there, which I do a lot of in this, just because the reflection of the stone is so bright that it just shines so much off of things like her fingernails, for example, and sort of the folds and wrinkles of her hands tend to have a really bright highlight on it just because it's so close to that light source. That also works really well on things like hair and things that require hard light. So using a luminosity layer just to add a little bit of that extra reflection and pizzazz. As you can see in the background where the clouds are, I have done that exact technique where I've taken my blending brush and I took the brightest color in the painting and I painted just the edges of the clouds, you know, like the silver lining type of thing, but it's more of a gold lining in this case. And just using that luminosity layer, I painted the lines to define the clouds. Just gives it a little bit more pizzazz, so I would recommend that technique if you struggle a little bit like me with just getting those really bright saturated colors in your painting. So yeah, definitely try that out. So now I'm just going in and refining the background, not the background, sorry, refining her the details of her arms and blending everything in together, because we're really getting to the point in the painting where I can really start working on the details. So the kind of logic I've used with painting the hand, considering where the light is that it will be hitting her fingertips the hardest because it's the closest, and really reflecting off of the folds and the wrinkles in her hands that's closest to it. Whereas if you look at her palm right here, what I'm doing is taking a bit of a darker green, and it's still creating a reflection. It's just that it's muted because her fingers are in the way and it's further away from the light source. So if that green amulet wasn't there, this whole part of her hand would regularly be in shadow. So I don't want to make it too bright because it just kind of removes it from the picture. Now what I've done here with the wrinkles in her palm is that I've used brush strokes to create a sort of roundness. The thing about brush strokes, especially if you're using a textured brush, which I often use, is that you want, like, let's say you're doing a cylindrical object like a finger or like a palm or like an arm, the temptation to do linear lines, like just straight lines up and down, not up and down, I guess it would be kind of like horizontal straight lines, is there, but I would recommend trying out doing round. How do I explain this? You basically want to have the brush strokes match the direction and the shape of the object. So if it's cylindrical, you want to do like C-shaped, circular almost brush strokes, because it gives a more realistic impression of the shape and the way that the light hits that kind of shape. So if you look at her arm, I've done what I've just mentioned I shouldn't do, which is these sort of up and down horizontal linear lines, brush strokes, whereas when you look at her palm, I have, not quite yet, but I will in a minute, go in with it and just create that rounder, more cylindrical shape that looks a little bit more realistic. So this is the part where I'm going in with that luminosity layer and I'm just adding more details and wrinkles. The reason I'm defining the wrinkles here on her thumb is because even though her thumb is obscured and in shadow, I think that those wrinkles would be illuminated because there is such a space between her pinky finger and her middle and index finger. So the light can really have an opportunity to peek through and illuminate that part of her hand. And once I got in there and started getting that detail in there, actually started making sense. So this is the part where I went in and I started highlighting a little bit with the orangey color of the front, or the orange color from the background, because this part of her hand is raised a little bit higher and it's really exposed to that ambient light in the background. So I want that to reflect on the hand. It's basically taking just some finesse and eyeballing to kind of guess where the green light ends and that orange ambient light begins. On honestly, I feel like a lot of painting and creating your own light and color sources is really just about eyeballing at the end of the day. It's about what looks right. And the best way to get better at this, honestly, is just observation. Just pay attention when you're living your life and you're looking around, when there's a sunset, when there's multiple light sources in a room. Just really try to study that and keep it in your mind bank for when you have to paint, because you will notice things. When you make an effort to actually put yourself out there to notice things like that, you will. So like when I'm out and about, I tend to look at how light hits certain objects and where the shadow falls, and sometimes I don't even understand it, but when I don't understand it, I can make a note of it and sort of look into it later. So that can really help. Sometimes you don't even need to draw to get better at drawing or painting. You just need to learn how to look at things. So I spent probably way too much time on the hands, but the thing about little tiny details like this is that I'm addicted to them. Nails, as I was talking about in my previous video, things like skin are soft and they absorb light, but things that are hard, like fingernails, for example, will reflect light. So the fingernails in this painting are going to be very highly reflective, and when I was painting it, I kind of envisioned that she had purple nail polish on, but because she's so close to this, again, green source of light that's ambient, it'll completely wash out any actual color that would be on her nails, so that's why they look like they're bright green. But when I started working on the second hand, and once again, I always like to do things one at a time, just like how in the previous video I did one eye at a time. In this video I've done one hand at a time, but I like doing that just because it gives me a bit of a reference point, and I feel like I've decided how I'm going to approach doing the hand. Now, in hindsight, I've decided that I think I did a little too much detail on the hands. Even though it's technically correct, it takes away a little bit too much attention from the face. And I'm also going to be adding a necklace later into the painting, and between the hands, the necklace, and the amulet, there's almost so much busyness around her chest that it's hard to focus on her eyes. So if I could do it all over again, I might do a little bit less detail on the hands. But I think what drew me to doing that in the first place was the fact that I really, really, really love a really realistic hand. Like, one of the number one things that I appreciate about marble sculptures is how realistic the hands are, with the veins and the tendons and the wrinkles and the fingernails and the cuticles. Like, I swear they get everything. So I'm really attracted to that kind of stuff in art, which is probably what led me to spending so much time on the hands. But I wanted them to be a major part of the painting. I just think I took it a little bit too far, but you know what? No regrets. So I'm just going in and adding some reflective light to the hair, small details, and I'm starting to work on this hand. Now this one's a little bit different because the other hand is kind of below the light source, so the light source is above it, whereas this one is above the light source, which means that it's only being lit from the bottom and the back of her hand is in shadow. So this one took a little bit more brain work because the the green is not as overpowering on this one, so I had to blend the actual color of the hand with the background shadow with this green light and make it look kind of realistic. So just to give myself an idea of what to do, I took that shadow, the purpley shadow color, and I used it to create the wrinkles on the back of the hand and really focus the green light just on the front of the fingers closest to the light. You'll notice that the pinky and the ring finger are actually spread apart a little bit, but it's kind of hard to tell because of the way that we're looking at this. So the way that I told that story was by putting a little bit of that green light on the ring finger so that you can tell that there has to be kind of a space or an opening for the light to shine in through. Yeah, so just working through like that pretty much does the trick. It took a lot of fortitude to sit here for, like, I think this particular part, like doing the hands, in and of itself took me about 3 hours because I was so insistent on getting them right, getting them as realistic as possible, following the reference photo as closely as possible, because the thing about hands is that I think hands are like an artist, the bane of every artist is the drawing the hand, but doing a really good solid hand study is such good practice. And even if you don't want to do like a big crazy painting like this, if you do a painting of a hand in a realistic way, I guarantee it'll help you understand how they work a lot better, and it will translate in your drawing and your sketching as well. The thing about painting for me is that it just gives me such an ability to see my drawings in a 3D kind of way. Well, where it's not just about the shape that is on the canvas, it's also about like the textures and the depth of it. Like, I'm not just thinking about the colors and the light, I'm thinking about the depth, like how far away from the camera are certain things. So that being said, again, if I had my time back, I would probably have made the hands a little bit less of a focus, or even separated them and blurred them just a tiny bit, so that the viewer is not so distracted by them. At this point, I'm basically just I hid the background layer so I can go in with an eraser tool and just refine the shape of the hands a little more. When you have your background layer on, especially in darker parts, it's really easy to make a little bit of a mess, or just get some brush strokes randomly flying around. So I just like to do that as I go along, so that I'm not having to go back after the fact when I'm exhausted and I'm really just don't want to keep painting anymore, to make sure that there aren't any like stray brush strokes everywhere. And the reason I'm really anal about that is because it really comes out in print. If you want to print your art, you have to be careful that when it's zoomed right in, there aren't any glaring mistakes or glaring brushstrokes that have gone astray. Because it may not be as obvious on a computer screen or a phone screen, but it will be very obvious in print. So that's the other thing I like to keep in mind while I'm painting, while I'm picking color palettes, and that is that the luminescence of the screen can affect how your painting turns out. So you want to consider, how is this going to look in print? And you can do your best to predict that, but I feel like it's not until you actually print your art that you really learn what it is that works. So if you're a digital artist and you've never printed your artwork before, honestly, like, you can just go to Staples or Walmart and just print it for like $1. Just take a look at it. It gives it a whole new dimension, a whole new meaning, and I guarantee that once you study it and look at it, you will consider more things next time you paint, about how things will translate when you print it. So I'm just going in now, and again with that luminescent layer that I talked about earlier, going in and just refining those little lines, and just making sure that the clouds in the background, everything is where it's at. See, I feel like at this point I kind of tend to procrastinate, because I know that I have to do some jewelry, and I love drawing shiny jewelry things, but I also like to procrastinate. So I'm just going in and adding a couple little details, like freckles, which I've done with a really opaque green color, just because it's going to be reflecting that green light. So now I'm going in and doing her earring. So I'm just doing these like shiny little pearly bauble things, and my technique for this is actually a lot more simple than it probably looks. The first thing I do is I just take a totally plain, totally like dense dark green color, and I lay it down with the pencil tool so that it's not see-through at all. It's just, there's a word for that, but I'm not thinking of it. Then I add the shiny bubbles with a plain green color, and then I do a little semicircle highlight in the direction of the light and a semicircle shadow in the opposite direction of the light. And I just go in with a super shiny highlight, just using a luminescent layer. So that it is honestly a really quick way to do it. So I'm just applying that exact same technique on the necklace. I'm drawing the shape of the necklace the way that I see it in the reference photo, and I'm just going back with that circle brush and drawing the foundation of how I'm going to lay the baubles on it. I don't even know what they are. They're like pearls, like bobbly, shiny pearls. They're really pretty. I'm really into it. So honestly, this can be ugly as hell because we're going to go back later and refine it a little more and make it look a little bit more nice. But I'm just starting with the chain here. I want to make a really nice, fine, delicate chain with a lot of reflective light on it to imply that it's silver. It's all going to be green, realistically, when we're painting it, but the actual object itself is silver. So we want to imply that even though we're using green color. Your mind is going to think it's silver. So we're going in with that light green color, and it is slightly opaque, just a little bit see-through because this creates a little bit more of I guess luminescent kind of idea. But so I just go in with that, and then it's the exact same technique that I used before, where I grab a slightly lighter green color and I do a semicircle. Oh, before I get to that, so what I've done here is I've taken a darker green and just created a little bit of shadow on the parts that are further away from the light source, and then I've gone in with a tiny little brush and I'm creating the semicircle shadows on all the baubles just to create some depth. And then I go in with the light color green and put it's not quite a highlight yet, it's just the lighter part of the bauble. And you can see already, like, it looks pretty legit, and I haven't done too much. So this is just like the most basic form of how to draw a circle with shadow, or how to draw a sphere. So as I get further away from the light source, I don't do as much detail. I already added some shadow over there just so that, again, it's not the primary focus of the painting. I don't want people spending so much time looking at this and just staring at the shiny baubles, even though, I mean, really, that's what we're here for, isn't it? So now I've gone in and I've done the luminescent reflective area, and then I actually split the necklace in half so that it matches perfectly. And I'm just doing a little bit of finessing on the centerpiece there. So now what I've done is I've gone in on a layer underneath, and I'm just going in and refining that initial dark green base that I laid down. So that's going to act kind of like a shadow, and it's sort of supposed to imply that the pearls are inlaid in some sort of silver casing. So if I just go in and make sure that all the circles match up, and even do a little bit of erasing to make everything good, and then, you know, it comes out really shiny. And again, since this isn't exactly the primary focus of the painting, I'm just going to take a little bit more of a super shiny bright airbrush and fade out that necklace a bit, just so it's not as obvious and your eye is not as drawn to it. The final thing that I'm going to do here is draw a chain that's holding up the necklace. Now, the reference photo also has a chain holding up the necklace, and it appears to be actually on her neck, and I thought it looked really cool the way she had it wrapped around her fingers, so I was just referencing that really closely. Now, what I've done to do a highlight on the chain is preserve the opacity of the layer. So I can go in and draw on top of it without drawing all the heck over it. So that's just a really quick way to make a small, fine thing kind of shiny without like having to go in and draw really carefully. This also follows the same rules as anything else. It's a reflective chain. It's got a light source right there. It's going to become pretty obnoxiously bright. The reference photo had a lot of rings in it, and I didn't want to overwhelm her hands with a bunch of rings because there's already so many details on her hands. I just decided to add 2 rings on her ring fingers. It's supposed to be implied that they're gold. I don't know how well I got that across because I had to rely so heavily on using green light to define the rings, but I also like to flip my canvas just to make sure everything doesn't look any wonky. You will notice, if you flip your canvases, you will notice proportion mistakes, I guarantee it. So you should definitely be working like that, where you're flipping your canvas horizontally and looking at it from a mirrored perspective, because it definitely helps. Alright, so I'm just doing some fine little details here, getting the last little blending things done. I like to go over the whole drawing and just make sure, again, there's no spare stuff everywhere, and the very last thing I do, as always, is sign my name and sign out. Alright, you guys, thank you so much for watching. This is the final piece. It took me about 9 hours, entirely in Paint Tool Sai. Let me know if you like this video, or if you want more like it, or if you want me to do any specific tutorials on these techniques. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing. I hope you guys learned something and have a great day.